for inviting me. I think ants are so important in management that someone like Brendan ought to give every farmer €1 an anthill in order to promote. But I realise that this is a rather extreme point of view, but I'm going to put a slightly extreme point of view in order to get my view over. And there are about 13 or 16 ant species which have been recorded on the Burren, depending on where you find the boundary. The problems are considerable. Undersampling, hardly anyone sampled it properly by pitfall trapping, soil sampling, or vacuum sampling. And also, ant specialists are prone to split. So, for example, Lasius niger was split in 91 into Lasius niger and Platythorax, which is probably far more abundant than Lasius niger, just as abundant on the Burren anyway. And when you've got Lasius flavus, you don't know whether you've got one of the other species which was formerly associated with it. And basically, I'm a lumper, and I'm more interested in what these organisms do than what they're called. But certainly the ant species are undersampled. My role, though, is to talk about most of the biodiversity on the Burren, which is in the soil. It's not those charismatic organisms which stick out of the soil from time to time. It's in the soil itself. The more important and the more diverse organisms are actually stuck in the soil. So this is the Burren ants' habitats in some detail, sort of places where I expect to find them. But if you look at that hazel scrub we went through yesterday, for example, you might find Lasius platythorax, Lasius fuliginosus, Lasius umbratus, Leptothorax acivorum. But how do you find it in such a patch? Especially since Lasius fuliginosus is actually a hyperparasite. It actually invades Lasius umbratus, which itself invades Lasius niger. And the change might take 20 years. So how do you happen to find it amongst all the species? And soil is a black box. We don't know much about it, especially on the Burren. It's the motor on which all charismatic species depend. It involves recycling of nutrients and so on. And lots of different organisms in the soil haven't been discussed at this conference so far. Earthworms, springtails, mites, aphids, nematodes, flatworms, mycorrhizae and other fungi, all very important in the soil ecosystem and affecting the health of the organisms living above. Not to mention all the bacteria, for example, involved in the nitrogen cycle. And this more or less sums it up. There's a horizontal line about 1/5 of the way down, separating the above-ground organisms most of you are interested in from the below-ground organisms, which I'm particularly interested in, with the trophic levels go from left to right. And you can see the range of different organisms in the soil, which are very abundant and very diverse indeed. But no one's really investigated them in great detail in the Burren, so there's still a great deal of work to do. So my role is to emphasize the importance and complexity of the yellow meadow ant, Lasius flavus, and return to ant management at the end. The Burren grasslands consist of 2 habitats. One is grasslands, but the other one is anthills, which are a distinct habitat. When you sample terrestrial vertebrates, any of you, whether you've sampled from an anthill or not, is important, and it should be recorded on your museum label. This ant, Lasius flavus, is a different kettle of fish from all the other organisms we discussed. It actually builds things, semi-permanent structures. It's in the same category as corals or beavers in building great big structures which are used by a wide range of other organisms. And so it's probably had a major effect on Burren biodiversity over a very long period of time. say, 6,000 years. It's the main mound builder in European grasslands. And these yellow ants, which we saw yesterday, are yellow and subterranean, up to 100,000 workers in a large mound. But I'll explain later that not all of them are in the mound. They dominate the whole soil beneath the surface, between the mounds as well. They carry the soil particles onto the surface after rain at night, and so you hardly ever see them. They're subterranean. They're engineers, farmers, and conservationists, and they produce heterogeneity. We've already seen the importance of heterogeneity at the conference. And anthills produce massive heterogeneity in grassland. You've got south, north, east, and west facing sides, different heights, lots of bare soil. And you've got, amongst diverse anthills, you've got tremendous heterogeneity itself. You've got abandoned ones, occupied ones, ones of different sizes, ones that face in different directions, on different slopes, and so on. And so ordinary grassland is boring. Grassland with anthills is really interesting. A nice study by John Breen, one of the few studies to be done in the Burren area, indicates that, yes, there is an increase in plant diversity on anthill sites, but that may be partly because they're rather older than sites which lack anthills. And therefore, there should be an accompanying increase in diversity of animal life as well. So one way you could recognize a good site to conserve would be a large number of large anthills on it. More of that later. So why is this species special? It's a keystone species. There are lots of definitions of keystone species. In this case, it's particularly numerous. And if you take its anthills out of the environment, it would result in the loss of lots of other plant and animal species from the environment. So in that sense, it's a keystone species. The mounds are very long-lived, and you can get up to 165 kilograms per hectare fresh weight of ants in an area, and in a dense population, they haul 7 million tons of soil to the surface per hectare every year. That's a particularly dense population, like only occurs once or twice in the Burren. So it has considerable ecological services, increases the species richness in flora and fauna, maintains bare soil, which may be important, certainly for overposition for grasshoppers, but also probably as sites for solitary bees and other organisms which require bare soil. They counteract leaching. They create aeration and drainage channels in the soil, rather like earthworms do, particularly important in acidic grasslands where earthworms tend not to be all that abundant. They're refuge for particular low-growing characteristic grass and plant species. So there are certain winter annuals which only occur on anthills. You find time-leaf sandwort, for example, and Veronica arvensis, and Saxifraga, Tridactylites, and all sorts of others. I've sort of identified about 40 different species, which in many places are merely confined to anthills and wouldn't occur in an area if the anthills weren't there. And they recycle nutrients from plants to soil by removing the aphid honeydew from the back ends of aphids on a large scale, so much so there's a very consistent pattern that the potassium ion content in anthill soil tends to be 3 times higher than the surrounding grassland. And that may well be because of the amount of aphid honeydew harvested by the ants. So this is a typical anthill. They also maintain, this one has got a characteristic shape. The ants build higher when they're surrounded by tall grasses, and that shape indicates that they grow rapidly when surrounded by, in this case, tall grass, Brachypodium pinnatum or rupestri. And then the extra lack of grazing has been removed because the rabbits were replaced by sheep, and the anthill has started growing at normal shape. But the important point is that here on the surface of the anthill there were various plants which had been maintained through the period of tall vegetation around the anthill by persisting on the anthill and then able to recolonize once the grazing has been resumed. So they're useful from that point of view as well. Now, in space and time, they were really abundant in British grazed pastures right up to 1780, during the period of maximum sheep grazing, and we imagine the same will happen in the Burren as well. There, you could walk right across Rutland or Northamptonshire just by walking from the top of one anthill to another. They were incredibly abundant. And then there was a massive eradication campaign. We imagine that was the case in the Burren as well. So all the Burren grasslands would have been colonised by anthills at one time, and the anthills counteracting the leaching effect of the soil into the grikes between the clints. And so, in fact, they probably slowed down the loss of soil from the limestone pavement. There was the farmers realised that the ants were competing with the sheep for photosynthate, because of course they do. Ants and sheep, these ants and sheep are in conflict for photosynthate. And so there was a big eradication campaign, and all the county agricultural accounts between 1780 and 1813 have a chapter on how to eradicate anthills. And they had a massive nationwide eradication campaign, and they've been reduced ever since. So they now only indicate old grasslands, although there's a big campaign in Britain, which I've spearheaded to some extent, to actually get these anthills back. They are more or less invisible, even to many biologists, I'm afraid. I've taken lots of biologists on field trips and find that there are hundreds of anthills scattered around, and they're more or less invisible to a typical mere invertebrate biologist. So these anthills could have survived glaciation, I'm sure that Brian wouldn't agree, or migrated from Britain before the land bridge was submerged. They would have declined during the woody phase up to 5,500 years ago. They expanded on subsequent grasslands, counteracting erosion by humans and cattle, probably rife until the potato famines. Then they still counteract erosion in glikes and replenish the upper soil, and the mounds may provide deep soil patches for scrub and woodland invasion. In fact, they may increase the invasion of hazel scrub. For example, on Sharon Parr's video, there's an interesting slide showing a hazel invaded an anthill, sitting on an anthill. And there have been several accounts from Scandinavia, or boreal regions, where the anthills provide the only deep soil on limestone and the main places where new shrubs get established. And this is going to be possibly quite important. Just a very quick run through a series of slides here. You can see how small the eyes are in the head, indicating a subterranean species. That shows the queen burrows into bare soil. They were doing this yesterday, trying to find bare soil where they lay their eggs and start forming a new colony. They form channels and chambers like this. And then this burial is important. It smothers rosette species. And so it favours species like wild thyme, capable of growing rapidly through the heaped soil. And this creates higher temperatures and reduced soil organic matter. And you get this small anthills to start with, which lots of people don't notice. They're smothering typically a rosette plant. And this shows the sort of situation you get in Great Britain. This is the Portland Ranges, the main anthill site in Britain, with something like 7 square miles, 3 million anthills. And you can see them on Google Pictures. So that's Bushy Park in London, an old royal park. That grassland was established in 1499, and you can see the anthills as distinct lumps. And so they are a distinct community. and ought to be recognized as such. And the heterogeneity is just exhibited in this slide, where on the left-hand side, my left anyway, you get a vigorous anthill with bare soil. On the right-hand side, you get an abandoned anthill, which is colonized by vegetation. There's a distinct succession taking place, so lots of grassland is actually ex-anthill. And you've got to bear that in mind. So they have a distinct vegetation. And I did various studies, which I'll just quickly flip through on the screen. When anthills become abandoned, shown in black, they actually reduce volume. When they are occupied, they continue to increase volume for probably hundreds of years. The only study I've lived long enough to produce was this. This shows logarithmic scale anthill volume going from left to right, and the proportion of anthills of different sizes. If you just focus on the blue, this shows that in 1970, most of these anthills are pretty small, whereas in green, in 2015, the same anthills exactly, so they'd all survived for that length of time, were much larger. And that's a logarithmic scale on the horizontal axis. And putting that together from 24 different sites, you get this rate of anthill population growth. Anthills are small when they start. They grow rapidly in size, but ultimately they achieve a maximum size and stabilize, where the rate of erosion equals the rate of accumulation. It's a value for lots of other animals: troughs, butterflies, aphids. The south side microclimate is important for invertebrates, and the early spring deer is important for deer. And this shows colonization by different organisms. They're got at by rabbits, sheep, deer, cattle, and mowing, and badgers, of course, foxes, dogs. And this exposes bare soil, which get colonized by bees' nests, and the bees' nests get attacked by mice, field mice, voles and shrews. So they actually contribute a lot to the habitats of other organisms. Just to show you some particular organisms particularly associated with this ant, these are Antennaphorus mites, Antennaphorus grandis. These wrap their crab-like forelimbs around the neck of the ant. And when the ants exchange liquid food, they stick their heads up and slurp some of it. These are very small mites, many of which are associated with anthills. This is the blind white woodlice Platyarthros hoffmannsegii, which you can find in Lasius nigers as well. And this is a beetle, staphylinid beetle on the left-hand side, Claviger testaceus, which is often associated with Lasius flavus anthills. And on the right-hand side, there's the little microdon, which we've got, Microdon devius, quite different from, well, a little bit different from Microdon mutabilis, but with the same, which Festuca lehmanni in the Burren supports a large population of. But this is Microdon devius. There are 4 species of this hoverfly in Britain, which never fly very far from the mounds themselves. There are 22 species of aphids, and most of the intake of energy comes from eating the aphids, which live on the roots of the surrounding plants in groups, in large numbers. They're collected by the ants in winter, they overwinter in lumps in the mounds, and then the ants replace them on the roots of the plants next spring. And there are very large numbers of these aphids, as I'll show. That shows a few I've extracted. But there are also incredible numbers of mites, very large diversity of mites, and springtails. And those are perhaps the main groups of fauna which I'll concentrate on. I sampled them with a soil auger around the mounds and on the mounds. You can see there that I've got 2 holes on mounds at either side, and 4 holes in grasslands in between with this soil auger, trying to see what was there. And they produces these sorts of cores. which are about 15 centimetres deep. So we hope that during the day, this contains most of the ants and other organisms I could find. I extracted them with a Torgren funnel. Lots of you probably know this system. You put a soil sample underneath a hot bulb, and the organisms less than 2 millimetres in diameter falls through the gauze into a lovely death in alcohol. And and then you sample them and try to identify them. And that's the setup you use. That's the standard battery. About 5 days will do it. And this is the result I got, which is maybe difficult to interpret for you, but the anthill is indicated by the blue circle in the middle. And the anthill has 73% of the ants. I did this on a very large scale. 27% of the ants underneath the surrounding grassland in the zone of the dominated by the anthill at the time. Most of the aphids were in the surrounding grassland. Most of the springtails and mites were in the surrounding grassland. But the aphids are particularly interesting. So it seems that the ant hill itself is the reproductive centre, and that's what the ants get on with. But the striking figure is at the bottom. Each square metre of the surrounding grassland had 5,500 worker ants. So when you're walking over this grassland, you can get thousands of worker ants. You're probably treading with every step on hundreds or tens of hundreds during the day of worker ants, which are on their way foraging to the lumps of aphids on the roots of the plants. And the aphids would clump lots of springtails and lots of mites. And then basically the ants are working as primary consumers because the honeydew is passing through the aphids to the ants, which go via honeydew to their larvae being fed in the mounds. And ultimately, some of the larvae become new queens. But probably each colony takes about 3,000 young aphids, because as they come out of the back end of the aphid, the little nymphs, the ants pick them up and take them directly to the larvae. They don't just feed on honeydew. And it's interesting that John Breen and his co-workers, Audrey O'Gorman, Grady, did a lot of research on this and found that actually the ants occupy in summer, in August, more or less, the second trophic level. But that's because they feed up the queens, no end, whilst after the queens have hatched from the pupae and they're sitting around on the top of the mounds, they're fed and they put on 2.5 times the weight by the ants themselves. And so the ants are feeding on the mites, the springtails, and the aphids themselves, and feeding them to the queens. So you can see the big difference in size. Big queens at the bottom, smaller workers and drones above. So Burren soils are seething with invertebrate life, and you ought to take that account. Lasius flavus mounds are quite frequent here and contribute a lot to the heterogeneity and diversity, counteracting the erosion and affecting the grassland between the mounds, not just the mounds themselves. So management. Most ant species have got short-lived, small, mobile colonies, and you can't really do much to manage them. They're adaptable and they don't require special measures. This ant is quite different in going up to high population sizes and building these long-lived structures. Watch out for the jet black ant, Lasius fuliginosus. I've seen mixed comments about whether this has been found inside the Burren boundary or not, crawling up trees in lines to milk aphids. Much more sampling required. Myrmica maintain the optimum balance of the main habitats, woodland, scrub, grassland, and Lasius flavus mounds, something which Brendan and the Burren Farmers Group are trying to do, reducing the amount of invasion by scrub. Ask local farmers what they think about anthills. Local knowledge is very, very important, and they're likely to know a lot and have a lot of comments on anthills. These Abundant large anthills are likely to indicate old grasslands. So grasslands usually accumulate plant and invertebrate species with age, so such sites need to be preferentially sampled and conserved. Anthills are resilient to damage by grazing animals. You need to maintain national park managers, farmers, conservationists to the value of anthills in maintaining floral and faunal biodiversity, as I was saying to Brendan just now, €1 an anthill. Anthills should be incorporated in management plans, are they? And nature trails for the public. Do you put anthills in your management plans? Certainly the RSPB is starting to do this, and also in public trails. I see that one round the Burren has got public anthills in it. In Burren villages and gardens, then anthills shouldn't be mown or destroyed. You should strim around them or scythe around them, which is something happening more in Britain now. And that will allow them to produce as many youngsters as possible in order to colonize the surrounding grassland. And youngsters should be encouraged to investigate anthills, to increase their appreciation. They're a wonderful way of teaching youngsters ecology. To show them the anthills, they can look at the plants and notice they're different. They can probe and activate the ants, which aren't very dangerous. And they love the whole exercise. Up at eye level, one anthill each, and a marvellous way to introduce youngsters. We actually moved some anthills from place to place. They're so precious. We created a big hole, top right, with a low loader, top left, and then picked up the anthill with a spade 70 centimetres deep and 110 across, and plonked it in the hole. And we did that 5 times, and all the anthills survived well at Richmond Park. And we advocate this as a way of moving anthills from place to place. And this got a lot of publicity in the newspapers and so on. And that's also an advantage of doing it this way. So that's the biggest ant I've ever found. And thank you very much.